Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm delighted to be very briefly introducing tonight's event. I'm also bringing the greetings of the director of Casa Italiana, Stefano Albertini. I just would like to begin by thanking really deeply the two organizers of this event tonight, my colleague Elena Bellina and Professor Giorgia Alou, who is also at this point a friend of Casa Italiana because we have already done things here in the past. And this event tonight is extremely important for many reasons. I mean, I don't want to talk much here because you will hear from the specialists, and we are going to see some extremely interesting audiovisual materials. But this is a very important project because it's really about mapping a history which hasn't really been told. What Giorgia and Elena have been doing over the past few years and the research they have been putting together really goes in this direction. You know, the title of this event is Contested Memory of Italian Captivity in World War II and After World War II, Mapping Italian military and civilian internees creativity. The notion of trying to track what happened in these camps is extremely interesting in many ways. It's also a very painful kind of memory to reconstruct, but it's, as I said, a story which hasn't been narrated in detail before. And through the work of Elena, Giorgia, and all the colleagues whom they have been bringing into this conversation, they are finding so many interesting personal narratives, collective narratives, which I think give us a much better sense of what these campi di prigionia were, because really that's a chapter of Italian history which has been removed, and even at the global level, I think there's much to be said and much to learn about this painful but global, interesting, and fascinating to some extent experience. It is also, I think, filled with a component of hope, because one of the beautiful, if I can say, silver linings of this narrative is that, people in the campi di prigionia were trying to cope with their situation by doing things together, mostly through artistic expression, music, the arts. And so I think the kind of message, if one which we can sort of share today, is really that even in, situations of hardship, there are ways to cope with hardship itself. So I just would, close my introduction because I want to make room for the real introduction and the real things. But again, I would like to begin with a round of applause for Giorgia Alou and Elena Bellina and for the amazing work they are doing on this project. And thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eugenio, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here tonight. And thank you to the people who'll be speaking from Milan, the representative of the Associazione per la Memoria degli Internati Militari di Letterkenny, who'll be talking briefly at the beginning of the event. I'm Elena Bellina, you just heard. I work here as visiting clinical assistant professor, and I'm very pleased to be here again this year with my colleague Giorgia Alou from the University of Sydney, Australia, to talk about Italian prisoners of war in Western Allied hands and, as Eugenio just said, what they did in their very long years of captivity in Africa, India, Australia, North America, and the UK, as you will hear as the evening goes on. Thank you very much, as usual, to NYU Casa Italiana, to the NYU Department of Italian Studies for their support, and for this two-day conference on the contested memory of World War II Italian military captivity, during which we will map the representation of Italian POWs in North America tonight and tomorrow night in Australia, with material that is coming out of Australia for the first time ever. We got special authorization from the Australian National Channel. So we are particularly happy to be here tonight, again, on this stage, because this is a place from where last year we launched the news that we got this very generous grant from the Australian Research Council for our 3-year project, Mapping Creativity in Captivity, meaning digging on what the Italian prisoners of war, who were very often kept for 6 or 7 years between 1940 and 1947, and originally captured in Africa were moved to India, Australia, Africa, North America, Europe again. What they did creatively, meaning object, and they wrote poetry, letters, books, and all sorts of creative objects that we are uncovering and mapping through, as you'll hear tomorrow night, an atlas of digital atlas of captivity. And this project started last year with another event, Preserving Memories of War Captivity and Their Legacy, Museums and Repositories. And it is held in conjunction with the exhibit Creativity and World War II Italian POWs in the US that will open on May 1st at the Calandra Institute, and the conference, The Bitter Bread of War, Multidisciplinary Perspectives for Italy and the Diaspora. And now, Giorgia.
Okay. Thank you very much, Elena. I'm Giorgia Lu. I teach and research in the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney. And again, I would like to extend my gratitude to Casa Zerilli-Marimò and the NYU Italian department for their generous collaboration and support to this event. As Elena has mentioned, these 2 evenings are part of this international project titled Mapping Creativity in Captivity During the Second World War. And the project formally started last year and is managed by the University of Sydney and conducted by a team of international scholars and cultural institutions across 7 countries, including Professor Bellina here and also Professor Anthony White, who will be here tomorrow from the University of Melbourne. So I invite everybody to come back tomorrow to hear more. So as Elena has mentioned, in the next 3 years, we will map the artistic, material, and cultural production and heritage of Italian detainees during the Second World War in the UK, Australia, the US, Africa, and Asia. And this project aims to offer innovative cross-cultural, transnational, and interdisciplinary insights into wartime experiences of captivity and imprisonment. The project's outcome includes publications, and a book volume is forthcoming, so hopefully it will be published next year. But it also includes seminars and workshops, and these are very important because they put together, create connections, linkages between scholars, so academics, but also students, and above all the community, the international community. A community made up also of children and grandchildren of some of these prisoners, and we have some tonight here as well. One of the key outcomes is a digital atlas, which is a digital platform, and tomorrow we will have the pleasure to showcase it. And then I would like to conclude saying that as we will hear tonight from our speakers, from their projects and research, all these will underscore our societal responsibility to revisit and critically examine past conflicts and the period of captivity, ensuring they are neither forgotten nor overlooked, thereby enhancing our understanding of human experience amidst historical adversity, while illuminating how these legacies continue to shape our present world. Thank you.
And the evening is, as you must see, pretty packed. So we will start the night with Alan Perry and Steve Mancini presenting on the history of POW in the US and especially in Letterkenny. We'll have the pleasure of having Carlo Borghetti and Antonio Brescianini connecting from Milan and talking more about the Associazione per la Memoria dei Prigionieri Italiani di Letterkenny. And after that, we'll have the screening of Fedeltà, the documentary by Steve Mancini. And after that, Charles Levitt will talk about Natale al Campo 119, a film about Italian prisoners of war kept in California in 1947, while Italian prisoners were still being returned and repatriated to Italy. And then we will continue with a Q&A session. And after the Q&A, if you want to stay, there will be the full screening of Natale al Campo 119. And tonight we are lucky enough to have Ruth Ben-ghiat with us to moderate the evening. Ruth Ben-ghiat is professor of history and Italian studies at NYU. She writes about authoritarianism, propaganda, and democracy protection. She is a recipient of many awards, including the Guggenheim Awards and Fellowship, and appears frequently on MSNBC and other media outlets. She publishes Lucid, a Substack newsletter on threat to democracy in the US and abroad, and her latest book, the bestseller Strongman Mussolini to the Present, examines how authoritarian leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over a century. She's a consultant also for TV and film productions, and she's a member also of the International Advisory Board for our Australia Research Council project on creativity and captivity. So, Ruth, if you can join the stage, thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Hi, can you hear me? So I'm going to introduce everybody at once. So we start with Carlo Borghetti and Antonio Brescianini from Milan. Carlo Borghetti has been a counselor of the Regional Council of Lombardia, the Legislative Assembly of the Lombardy region since 2010 for the Democratic Party. He's currently a member of the Council's Health, Budget Planning, and Social Sustainability Committees. He's a supporter of the Associazione per la Memoria dei Prigionieri Italiani a Letterkenny. He believes that understanding and documenting the complexity of Italian World War II memory is essential to understanding our present history. Antonio Brescianini is the founder of the Associazione per la Memoria dei Prigionieri Italiani a Letterkenny, an association that gathers the descendants of the over 1,200 Italian prisoners of war kept at Letterkenny to document the cooperators of war who worked at the army depot there. And this association started when Mr. Brescianini started to trace down the POWs' descendants in Italy and in the US, establishing strong ties between the memories of the Letterkenny POWs in Italy and in Pennsylvania. We'll also hear from Alan Perry, professor of Italian, and Mahan, professor of Christian Studies at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. His interests as a scholar focus on commemoration and representation of Italy in World War II and the way Italians use Christian typology to formulate the meaning of tragedy and the cultural rebirth of Italy after the war. And he's published extensively on the humorist Giovannino Guareschi. He studied the folklore of World War II Italy, and he's currently investigating the material culture that Italian POWs crafted in their various detention camps in the United States. We also have with us Steve Mancini, who's assistant professor of computer information systems at Morris University. He's an expert in the field of cybersecurity with over 30 years of experience and research around the world, but he's here as an international award-winning filmmaker, and his recent film, Fedeltà, Soldier Prisoner, has been accepted into film festivals in 6 different countries and various US cities, and it has won numerous awards, including Best Feature Documentary at the Dallas Movie Festival and Best First-Time Director at the Bomarzo Soul Place Film Festival in Italy. In addition, Steve also hosts the Italian Impact podcast, which is available on all major screening services, and he was recently appointed honorary Italian consul in Edinburgh. Should I introduce Charles as well? Yeah. So, and then after we see the film Fedeltà, we will hear from Charles Levitt, the fourth, who's associate professor of Italian and film and associate director of the Center for Italian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He's the author of the wonderful book, Italian Neorealism, A Cultural History, which was awarded the 2020 Book Prize in Visual Studies, Film, and Media from the American Association for Italian Studies, and it was also shortlisted for the Bridge Literary Prize in North American Nonfiction. Charles Levitt will talk about the Italian representation of Italian POWs in movies in 1947. As Elena mentioned, we'll discuss Natalia al Campo 119. And this was at a time when POWs in Allied hands were still being repatriated. So those are our wonderful speakers, and now I will call Alan to the stage.
Allora, Carlo comincio adesso, vogliono salutare. Carlo e Antonio, per piacere, se volete dare un benvenuto e io faccio il traduttore, va bene? Carlo, prego.
Ok, inizio io?
Sì, inizia tu.
Okay, thank you. I can speak a bit of English, and so I want to say good evening to everyone, and I'm very happy to be here with you, to be here by internet, I mean. So I think that this evening we have a very important story for our days. This is a story of the Second World War, but it's not a history of war, but an history of friendship and of dialogue and solidarity. A great example for us nowadays. My English is not so good, so I can continue in Italian. So Alan, you can translate. I mean, maybe it's better.
Come vuoi.
Io penso che è importante coltivare la memoria del nostro passato.
It's very important to cultivate the memory of our past.
Perché la memoria non è data per sempre, la memoria si può dimenticare, può sparire.
Because memory is fleeting. It can be, it's malleable.
E allora noi dobbiamo organizzare la memoria, cioè trovare gli strumenti per rendere vivo ancora oggi gli insegnamenti del passato.
And we have to organize memory. We have to find instruments to be able to harbor it and present it.
Io nel Consiglio regionale della Lombardia ho promosso una legge proprio per portare i giovani studenti sui luoghi della memoria della Seconda Guerra Mondiale.
And he is in his political office in Lombardy has been at work with promoting laws that will make it easy for students to be able to have the ability to go to sites of memory.
Ogni anno l'istituzione regionale accompagna centinaia di studenti sui luoghi della Seconda Guerra Mondiale, sui campi di concentramento, sui luoghi delle battaglie, per tenere viva questa memoria.
Yeah, and so keeping World War II memory alive in Italy, they go to different battlefields, different cemeteries, different concentration camps to keep the memory alive.
E stare oggi in quei posti è ancora un modo molto potente per trasmettere il ricordo di quella storia, ma non può essere l'unico modo.
It's one of the very, very powerful ways to promote the memory, but it can't be the only one.
E allora quando io ho partecipato insieme ai figli dei prigionieri che furono a Letterkenny a questo viaggio, ho pensato insieme agli altri amici che bisognava organizzare una associazione con i parenti per promuovere questa memoria.
And in 2015, when he came with the first group to Letterkenny, he thought it would be very, very important to organize an association to promote the memory of this experience.
Siccome noi stiamo perdendo i testimoni oculari di quella storia, abbiamo bisogno che chi l'ha sentita con le sue orecchie la tramandi agli altri, e quindi noi come associazione abbiamo questo obiettivo.
And the goal of our association, since so many now are no longer available, those that witnessed it firsthand, to be able to transmit those that did get it from them to the next generation.
Ecco, solo due parole ancora per dire che questa storia è una storia, dicevo, di amicizia e di collaborazione tra le persone, ma anche tra gli stati in quel lontano 1943, 44,
And
45.
this is an experience of our organization that is one of friendship and collaboration between different parts, actually, of the world.
Ricordando quella storia vediamo come è possibile vivere in pace partendo da posizioni differenti e trovare un modo comune di risolvere le questioni.
And it is absolutely important to know that peace can be experienced between different people in going forward from this experience.
Esatto, e questo ovviamente è ancora più importante considerando il momento attuale che stiamo vivendo nel mondo di grandi divisioni, guerre e contrapposizioni,
Yeah,
quindi un grande esempio per noi.
Especially now with the way that the world is with different conflicts that are going on.
E finisco dicendo che i frutti di quel modo di vivere di quelle persone che non erano considerate prigionieri, ma erano considerate persone umane come tutti gli altri, sono frutti che ancora oggi noi vediamo, e quindi avere questo tipo di atteggiamento tra le persone, tra gli stati, porta frutto e porta molto lontano, diversamente dalle guerre.
And differently than war, the collaboration between nations, between states that the AMPIL is trying to really promote is in fact able to do this, to bring this example of peace to the world.
E quindi sono molto felice di questa occasione, e questa è un'occasione in più per mostrare questo docufilm di Steve Mancini, che è un altro modo ancora di raccontare quella storia. La fantasia non ha limiti, dobbiamo trovare il modo di parlare di questa storia, di parlare ai più giovani e di portarla ancora in giro perché il mondo ne ha bisogno.
And it's absolutely necessary, and very happy to be here present at this occasion. To another way to promote this memory and to promote peace.
Grazie, grazie a tutti voi.
Grazie, Carlo.
Grazie.
E ora passiamo la parola ad Antonio Brescinini. Antonio.
Good evening. E porto volentieri i saluti personali dell'AMPIL a questa conferenza.
He is happy to bring all the greetings from everybody in the AMPIL to us this evening.
Io sono presidente onorario e responsabile delle attività che abbiamo in Italia per quanto riguarda l'esperienza dei nostri prigionieri.
He is the actual founder of the AMPIL and a former president, honorary president, and responsible for continuing to promote the memory of all of these prisoners.
Prima di tutto desidero ringraziare la New York University Casa Italiana per l'invito a questo importante momento, in particolare le professoresse Elena e Giorgia per l'invito, e questo momento che fa memoria di una storia poco conosciuta dalla Seconda Guerra Mondiale.
In thanking Elena and Giorgia, he would like to also know that this is again, as we've said, a story that part of the Second World War that not many people know of.
Due sono i rilievi principali che desidero ricordare.
He'd like us to remember two principal things.
Il primo è il filo conduttore di questa storia così unica e straordinaria dei prigionieri di guerra italiani a Letterkenny e senza dubbio la costruzione della Chiesa della Pace.
Yeah, it's the most important strand of memory is the experience that led to the construction of the chapel that still serves today as a symbol.
Costruita all'interno del campo di prigionia, diventa in seguito monumento storico in America.
So all the life that took place among the prisoners became material through this symbol.
È il simbolo che fa memoria dei nostri familiari e che hanno testimoniato in terra straniera valori umani e di solidarietà.
Yeah, and it's one that symbolizes values, deep human values of solidarity among peoples. This chapel that was built.
Le circa 600 famiglie contattate in Italia in questi anni, su 1230 prigionieri presenti a Letterkenny, emergono ancora forti emozioni nel ritrovare fotografie o documenti.
Yeah, so when this association was formed and people came together, the incredible experience, emotional experience of finding pictures and then uniting together is something that now of these prisoners that were detained here through the generations, they're able to relive that.
I prigionieri italiani in vita hanno sempre ricordato il buon trattamento ricevuto durante la prigionia da parte dei soldati americani, rispettosi della dignità della persona.
Yeah, it's very important to keep in mind that the prisoners that came back would relate how good their treatment was at the hands of the Americans, and they passed that on.
Il secondo aspetto che desidero ricordare è che questa storia è ancora viva a distanza di 80 anni.
It's still alive, this story, after 80 years. That's the other thing that's very important he wants us to know.
Ha permesso di costruire un ponte di dialogo e amicizia con il popolo americano.
It really allows them to have a friendship and ways of dialoguing with us.
In modo che questo ricordo non appartiene solo all'Italia, ma è condiviso con gli Stati Uniti, testimoniando così alle generazioni future il valore della pace.
And this is something that's also carried on with stories here in the United States that also promote, together with theirs, the future of peace.
Alle mie spalle è esposto la bandiera della città di Chambersburg, che è offerto dal sindaco di Chambersburg nella visita del 2015 alla delegazione italiana.
That's the honorary banner of the city of Chambersburg, where Letterkenny is located, that they honored Antonio with in 2015, the first time that they came back. That the group's, the first formal experience of coming back. They honored.
Per noi è un bene prezioso che ci ricorda tutte le volte che usciamo a fare le mostre fotografiche, viene esposta proprio in segno di amicizia.
It's an incredible symbol and honor for us, especially when we go around Italy showing this itinerant display of all the different aspects of life at Letterkenny.
Colgo l'occasione di ringraziare il professor Alan Perry che ci ha permesso di ricostruire questa storia.
And he's also thanking me for helping him to weave this story together.
Mr. David Shaman di Chambersburg per l'attenzione e l'accoglienza che rivolge costantemente alla nostra associazione.
And Dave Shamana in Chambersburg, the former president of the Chamber Council, Chamber of Commerce, that helped organize this.
E al professor Steve Mancini che ha voluto realizzare il docufilm su questa esperienza dei prigionieri italiani.
And Steve Mancini, who is the documentarian who brought this to film.
Per finire, concludo dicendo che la Chiesa della Pace e il docufilm rappresentano due punti di riferimento per far memoria positiva della presenza dei prigionieri italiani in America, da tramandare alle future generazioni.
So both the film and the material of the chapel are two ways of promoting the positive memory of the experience.
Vi ringrazio tutti dell'attenzione.
Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, Antonio e Carlo, per piacere, cosa succede in settembre quest'anno?
A settembre faremo una visita come delegazione italiana a Chambersburg nell'80° anniversario della costruzione della chiesa e del rimpatrio dei nostri prigionieri in Italia.
The anniversary of the construction and dedication of the chapel and the repatriation. So it's 80 years after, and we've got this experience continuing.
Vorremmo ricordare nella chiesetta della pace con una Santa Messa il cardinale il Monsignor Cicognani, nunzio apostolico, e tutti i nostri genitori che hanno vissuto su quel luogo e incontrare gli amici americani.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to meeting with our American friends to remember when the Delegate General of the Vatican came and dedicated the chapel in May of 1945. Grazie. Okay.
Alan, posso aggiungere solo una parola?
Sì, prego.
La data in cui saremo a Letterkenny è l'11 settembre, una data altamente simbolica.
Yeah, so they're going to be celebrating this on our anniversary, September the 11th.
E siccome la chiesetta ormai è chiamata Chiesetta della Pace, la memoria delle vittime dell'11 settembre e di tutte le guerre, celebrata alla Chiesa della Pace di Letterkenny, vuole anche significare la speranza di un mondo di pace, che è possibile.
And given this particular occurrence of the celebration, their celebration in Chambersburg, together with ours, it's particularly important in the promise of peace, because the chapel is called the Chiesetta della Pace, the Chapel of Peace, and going forward. Grazie, grazie Carlo.
Grazie.
Grazie. Buonanotte. Grazie. I would like to give you all a general introduction to the Italian imprisonment experience, detainment experience in the United States during World War II. Dates really go for, it's a 3-year period we're looking at, 1943 to 1946. So during World War II, the Allies captured 600,000 POWs. The Americans specifically held 125,000 of these soldiers, most of whom were captured in North Africa and Sicily in the summer of 1943. Several months earlier, in September 1942, a few weeks prior to the Operation Torch military landings in North Africa, U.S. Generals Dwight David Eisenhower and George C. Marshall agreed that all prisoners of war captured during the operation would be sent, all Italian prisoners of war, would be sent directly to the United States. As events unfolded, however, the need for manpower in theater convinced American authorities to send only around 50,000 to the United States. Another 75,000 Italians remained in North Africa or later trailed Allied advances into France and Germany. Americans searched their prisoners, Italian prisoners, upon capture and permitted them to keep their military uniforms, insignia, and medals. However, they confiscated all their weapons, equipment, communication devices, flashlights, cameras, binoculars, and radios. In various reports and oral histories, many POWs recall these sad and dark days of early captivity, especially in North Africa, through their memory of interminably long marches, never-ending railroad trips in crowded and stifling hot conditions, and detention in camps, temporary camps, totally devoid of means to promote proper hygiene and basic comforts. From their various prisoner camps, temporary processing camps in North Africa and later Sicily, the Americans sent most of the Italians to Casablanca and Oran for transport across the Atlantic to the United States. The POWs boarded Liberty ships for a voyage that took about 3 weeks, 2.5 to 3 weeks, with the destination in the United States in 3 points: New York City, Boston, or Norfolk, Virginia. When they disembarked, they underwent extensive personnel hygiene and medical checks. Barbers shaved their hair, and they took showers, their first in months, with soap and hot water. U.S. military personnel disinfected their clothes, and they acquired new uniforms that carried the printed letters PW. During this process, the Americans interrogated them, snapped their official identification photo, registered their fingerprints, and assigned them an official POW serial number if they did not already have one. The International Red Cross also provided them with a postcard to send to their family and loved ones in Italy that documented their status and communicated the mere fact that they were still alive. Finally, the POWs still under guard then boarded trains where they were transported to initial military installations. Their first military prisoner of war camps here in the United States. This is the Italian POW camps in the United States. When they first came in 1943, there were primarily 8 or 9 of them in Missouri, Fort Carson, Colorado, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. So until 1943, these Italian POWs were treated in the same manner as German and Japanese detainees under the 1929 Geneva Convention Accords that detailed the treatment of war prisoners. They were employed in work initiatives tied to the maintenance of their detention camps and projects not connected to combat operations. The U.S. War Department and other federal and private agencies govern policies relevant to their captivity. But after the Italian armistice and subsequent Italian declaration of co-belligerency with the Allies, the armistice is in September 1943, about a month later, co-belligerency in October 1943, the U.S. and state and War Departments began to explore how the large numbers of Italian POWs that were taken could be best utilized by the United States without trying to not contravene the Geneva Convention Accords. Since active combat conditions continued to ravage Italy, the U.S. did not repatriate immediately Italian POWs to their home country. The U.S. War Department also refused to authorize the formation of Italian military units manned by POWs that would be sent back from the United States to fight the Nazis, Wehrmacht, and fascists in Italy. Instead, given the U.S. home front shortages of labor, the War and State Departments began to devise a plan that allowed Italian POWs the opportunity to swear allegiance to the United States and serve in what became Italian Service Units, ISUs. This plan, and here's an example of the actual oath that these soldiers were given the opportunity to take. This plan would offset the labor shortages in key distribution sites and ostensibly free up more U.S. soldiers to directly aid U.S. combat operations. By February 1944, the U.S. government officially sanctioned this ISU program, one that even included support for labor directly involved in aiding U.S. military mission, not with combat, but with providing support, material support for the war. Interrogation of most of the 50,000 POWs got away to determine political, mental, and physical suitability for this program. They were also trying to weed out those that were very hardline fascists. This initiative took place unilaterally, without the official sanction of the newly reconstituted Italian government that was led by Pietro Badoglio. Of the 50,000 Italian prisoners taken to the United States, 70%, around 36,000 of them, formally agreed to cooperate. Most of these soldiers were then organized into 192 ISUs, company-sized ISU, about 300 to 400 troops per company. According to U.S. officials, only about 4,800 Italian POWs officially declared themselves as non-cooperators, non-collaborators, while another 10,000 were not included in those numbers that actually served in the ISUs. These soldiers nevertheless undertook various labor duties if they had sworn allegiance. Between February and April of 1944, prisoners who chose to collaborate were then moved to 70 definitive detention camps. The Italian government never issued an official order to the prisoners, informing them of what they were expected to do. There was no formal announcement, even a formal agreement with the United States. This was unilateral. So in several camps, confusion reigned as troops and officers tried to decide what to do, how to best discern what action to take. In the end, those Italians who did not cooperate, chose not to cooperate, were segregated from those that did. And eventually, all non-cooperating Italian POW officers, were sent to Hereford, Camp Hereford, Texas. Other troops were sent to, NCOs and enlisted were sent to Camp Florence in Arizona, and as well to the Hawaiian Islands. Camp Hereford was distinct because it held many highly educated inmates who, after the war, achieved national and international success as gifted artists, intellectuals, musicians, journalists, entrepreneurs, and politicians. Unfortunately, POWs detained at Hereford had to contend at times with armed searches, harsh American guards, and greater boredom. They weren't doing anything, many of them. They lived a more classically understood experience of wartime imprisonment, barbed wire. Several of them dug tunnels and attempted to escape. And sadly, after the European War, during the summer months of 1945, Herefordian non-collaborators were actually subjected to starvation. They were subjected to great amounts of caloric reduction, and they experienced what they call la grande fame. So this was one of the ignominious aspects, but that was an outlier. Shameful as it was an outlier. By contrast, the POWs that did agree to collaborate experienced several perks not given to those who refused. As you'll see in tonight's documentary, for example, they wore American uniforms devoid of any reference to POW status that included the shoulder patch with the word in capital letters, Italy, that they wore in their left shirt and jacket sleeves. They received $24 as a monthly salary, a third of which, $8, was paid in actual currency rather than entirely in script for the non-collaborating prisoners received. Script to go and use them at the PXs, use them at the distributions within the camps, or primarily within Hereford. They could also, the collaborators, the cooperators, could also host a greater number of guests at their camp per month, and they even had the possibility of leaving their compound to visit during field trips in nearby towns and cities. As earlier stated, the Italian POW collaborators made up for the huge drop in available manpower that the military had siphoned off to fight the war. In total, from 1 May 1944 to 31 January 1946, the Italian service units worked over 18 million work days while receiving about a tenth in the pay that American civilians earned. Moreover, their cooperation freed up thousands of American guards for possible service in combat units. Italian prisoners held in the United States, both cooperators and non-cooperators, collaborators and non-collaborators, were decidedly the best treated and accommodated during the entire Second War by any detaining power. They had excellent food, access to great medical care, opportunities for physical exercise and for music and mental relaxation. They had an impressive support structure of relatively large Italian-American communities, especially on the East Coast, that provided material provisions, political backing, and elevation of morale. The Catholic Church also provided great spiritual and material support to the vast majority of POWs who were Catholic. Diocese sent priests into detention camps to celebrate masks, hear confessions, and at times send back news to Italy, primarily through the Vatican channels under the, Antonio mentioned him, this is Amleto Cicconiani, to get news back to Italy. Finally, Italian POWs imprisoned in the U.S. were also the first to be repatriated. In fact, the last Italian POWs returned to the United States about a year before they did elsewhere. So we're looking at late 1946, early 1947. As Steve Mancini's Fedeltà Soldati Prigionieri shows, the Letterkenny Army Depot POW story near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, was a very uplifting one, by and large, and its legacy continues to inspire others to this day, as you got from the testimony here tonight from Carlo and from Antonio. Italian cooperators arrived there beginning in April 1944, and by 1 May of that year, a contingent of approximately 1,200 Italian soldiers formed the 321st Italian Quartermaster Battalion. It consisted of 5 company-sized ISUs, and since the depot was still relatively new, it had been actually just brought into existence in February 1942, they were the ones that helped build the depot, putting in sidewalks, putting in fencing, building buildings. For duty, these soldiers stocked munitions, repaired equipment, and shipped goods to both the Pacific and European theaters of war. With their greater liberties, as you're going to see tonight, Letterkenny POWs actually and eventually gained the trust of local residents in Chambersburg and formed lifelong friendships, several of them that resulted in marriage. A lasting monument, as we've mentioned, a military chapel that the POWs constructed on their own time, is still extant and serves as an emotional material symbol for the memory of the Letterkenny detention experience. Thank you for this overview. Buona visione.
I think we're a little behind. Let me just be honest. I'll be very quick then. I want to thank everyone for coming here tonight. I want you to know you're getting the edited version of the film, so if you don't like it, we'll blame the editing. That was a joke. I do want to thank everyone who helped me with this. So Dr. Alan Perry was actually very pivotal in the film, and so was Antonio Brescianini and Carlo Borghetti. When I first read about the story, I was actually introduced by a friend of mine. I had to Google it. I grew up in Pittsburgh and never heard of a Italian prisoner of war camp 3 hours away from my house. So not only, when I decided to do a documentary, my fixation on it was more on the gentleman who told me the story, who was an Italian who was actually in Italy during the war as a child, and he kind of survived his village being occupied. And when he came to America, he kind of didn't want anything to do with the United States or with Italy for a while. So eventually he kind of rediscovered his roots back to Italy, and then he started to really push out and, you know, promote the Italian culture in Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio. So he became kind of a mentor of mine before he passed away, and this was just one of the stories he told me, and shortly after he died, I decided I didn't want to wait any longer. I wanted to do the film. I thought I was going to show up at Chambersburg with a camera and film a chapel and talk to a few local folks. And little I know, there's an international organization. There's prisoners of war camp all over the world. There's survivors. There's survivors in the United States. I blew my mind. So this turned out to be something far greater. Now, I'm going to tell you one thing, and then I'm going to go sit down so we can get back on track. I was so inspired. When I went to show the film in Italy, I actually had the opportunity to learn a lot more, how do I say this? Talking with the families really opened my eyes to a lot of things. You don't care about the story if you just say, like I said, oh, it's some prisoners, was 80 years ago, they had it pretty good. I don't think people understand the result of treating them well in a really bad time for humanity literally has an effect to this day. Those people speak about America as if their dad came back yesterday. And I don't think a lot of people understand it until you talk to these families. Listen to the words they're telling you. They're all about peace, 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 and they're all about not wasting the lessons of the past. The hardest thing, I'm a professor. I don't teach history, which is ironic that I actually have a passion for history. But the hardest thing is to convince students why they need to care. And you know, there's an old adage, youth is wasted on the young. I can't beat it into them, but all we can do is we can document. We can document, and then what you do is you plant seeds, and you just hope that later on, when the kids, the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, grow up, they remember this, and it's something they have a further interest in, and that's how you keep the memory alive. So don't think for a minute that you are wasting your time when you talk about history. You're not. You're planting a seed. I didn't like it when I was growing up. Actually, that's a lie. I kind of did. I loved Roman history. I still remember when Alaric sacked Rome in 410 AD, and I remember that from high school. But I'm kind of a weirdo in that sense. But most people, they don't care. But they will later on. And I'm going to tell you one final thought. When I was doing the film, the individual that introduced me to the story, he just passed away a few months earlier. And he never gets a chance to watch the film. After I watched the film, I realized there were so many questions I wanted to ask him. So I would tell you this, final thought. Talk to the younger generation. And when I went to Italy, I told the younger generation this. I said, ask your grandparents questions. I said, I don't care whether you care or not. And I don't care if you think they're listening or not. You tell them and you ask the question, because there's going to be a time when you can't ask that person that question, and that is going to eat you like you won't believe. So remember that. You're not wasting your time telling those stories. So keep doing it, keep pushing the memory, and keep this alive. This is a beautiful story, not just because I made a film on it, I'm not gonna lie, I enjoyed that, but it really is a beautiful story, and it literally changed my life. I'm going back this year to do another story on another issue in part of the Second World War in Abruzzo. Never heard of it. Went there, showed the film, was introduced to some folks, and said, I'd never heard these stories. So I'm going to keep pushing, my little corner of the world as best I can, and I encourage you to talk to the younger generation, whether you think they're listening or not. You're planting a seed. So thank you very much. I do hope you enjoyed the film, and we will be available for questions afterwards. Thank you.
That is a tough act to follow, so let me do my best. I think where I'd like to start is with the comments of so many of those people about how fundamental the experience of those prisoners of war in the United States was for them, was for their families, has been for families down through the generations. And I think I want to emphasize that point because if you were to look at the films of the Italian post-war period, you wouldn't have that understanding at all. And I think that's quite surprising. I think all the more surprising after watching that film. Because one of the things that really characterizes those films of the immediate post-war period is that there is an attempt, in fact, I think it's the thing that really sets them apart, is that there is this attempt to try to capture the history that they've just lived through. So you have films again and again depicting the experience of German occupation and also the experience of Allied occupation. Films that depict the experience of the liberation. Films that depict the transitional justice of the move from fascism to the post-war governments, films that depict post-war poverty, unemployment. The films, in other words, are characterized by this attempt to capture the history, and the history that they don't capture, though, is the one that we've just seen in that film. It's never, in fact, with one exception, the exception that you'll have the opportunity to see later on this evening, with only one exception, do they actually depict, in that immediate post-war period, those prisoners of war in the United States. And in fact, with very, very few exceptions, they really don't depict the experience of the prisoners of war at all. Now, what they do, however, is, in fact, make a concerted effort to examine the experience of the prisoners of war when they return to Italy. Right? This is seen as being, in fact, crucial. This article from the journal Cinema in 1949, Il cinema capito I reduci, right, looks at the question of the reduce, a word that combines a number of different roles that we might otherwise distinguish in English, right? It's a veteran, so any soldier who comes back is a reduce, but it's also a prisoner of war, and it's also a survivor of a concentration camp. The word reduce tends to blur those experiences, but in all three of those different roles of survivor, of veteran, and of a prisoner of war, the film industry, the feature films of the Italian post-war period really tried to capture what it meant to come back to Italy. Right? This was seen as the mission of cinema to a certain degree. To look at, in fact, what it meant to be a reduce who is not, as in previous wars, returning glorious, right? But who is returning, often as this article on the parole nuove, the new words of the post-war period notes, returning badly damaged, right? If you're returning from, say, a German prisoner of war camp, that was very much the experience. So the cinema is interested in what happens when they set foot back in Italy, in the lives that they're able to recreate once they're back in Italy, in the struggles that they have in reinserting themselves into civilian life back in Italy. But I think shockingly not interested in the experience that they'd actually had abroad. And you can see this in any number of films. In order to not keep you too long before the question and answer session that I imagine you're interested in engaging with, I'm going to limit my comments to just two films, but you have to take my word that they're exemplary of these other post-war films. Films like La vita ricomincia, Life Begins Anew of Mario Mattoli of 1945, which shows a prisoner of war who returns to Italy after having been in India for 6 years, But the film begins, as I'll show you right here, as he sets foot back on Italian soil. So the first shots show the soldier, he's here played by Fosco Giacchetti, who had been in any number of war films, empire films under fascism. But here he's shown now back in Italy. We see the destruction of bombed Italian cities. He later on passes through Monte Cassino and eventually returns to Rome. And here the film focuses on the struggles that he has when he returns to his family. His wife, we learn, has been forced into prostitution in order to buy medicine to save their son. And what the film tries to work through is, whether he's able to forgive her, whether he's able to find forgiveness himself, and whether he's able then to successfully return to his life in Italy, to rebuild his family. And spoiler alert, he does, but only in the very final moments of the film. My interest here is on those first moments, right? Because they're the first moments back in Italy. We see nothing of the experience in Italy, in India. It's mentioned only once. He's been away. What matters from the Italian perspective is that he's been away. The same is true of another film, again from a year later, Il Bandito, The Bandit of Alberto Lattuada. This is a film about two prisoners of war who have returned to Italy and who find in their return that their lives are very different. One comes back to find his daughter, his family, his home, his job, and starts again a happy life. And his friend who returns with him finds instead that his apartment has been bombed, is gone, his mother has passed away, and his sister is now a prostitute. And unable to rebuild his life, he becomes, as the title suggests here, a bandit. This is a gangster film. But it's a gangster film that begins just like the last film I showed you, La Vita Ricomincia, that begins with the return to Italy. The first shots that we see are of this train with all of the prisoners of war on board as it pulls into the station and returns them to their home in Torino. And you can see, again, I'll show just a few shots for reasons of time, right? But we're told that they're coming from Austria, that they're prigionieri di guerra, prisoners of war, right? Viva USA, there we get a sign perhaps of what their experience has been. Anche usata. But again, I think, and here I'll underline and conclude my point, but I think it's quite telling that once again, it begins as they've returned, that no emphasis at all is placed on the experience that they've had abroad. All of the questions are about what's going to happen now that they've come back to Italy. And if you watch the post-war films, very often this figure of the reduce, of the returned soldier, of the veteran, of the survivor, is a key figure and a destabilizing figure, a very symbolic figure, a very resonant figure, but one who's not depicted in the life before, in the life in the camp, in the life in prison, with only one exception. The exception is the film that they're going to screen later on this evening, a film that I have been asked to tell you about, and a film that I'm very happy, in fact, to tell you about, that I hope you'll stay to see, a film called Natale al Campo 119, Christmas at Camp 119, which is a fictional film about a fictional camp in California, but that tries, as all of these other films do not, that tries to capture something of that experience of being a prisoner of war overseas, in this case in the United States, like those prisoners in Letterkenny, and that tries to link that experience back to their lives in Italy, to draw the connections that those other films are leaving implied. And to give a sense of how exceptional this film is, I think I would only just point out that the next film to look at that experience, the next Italian film to try to capture that experience, doesn't come out until 2002. Between 1947 and 2002, there isn't another one. That film is Giorgio Serafini's Texas 46. It's called The Good War. But between the two, there isn't any, unless I'm terribly mistaken, but I have looked carefully, and others have as well, and this appears to be the only one. And it's a film that uses humor, that uses song, that uses a strong sense of nostalgia, sort of touristic view of Italy, but that nevertheless, I think, is trying to do something significant in capturing something of the experience that the film that we've just seen is trying to depict as well, about people who find, in fact, livable and very positive conditions in America that begin to allow them to change, to develop, and to return home new men. And I just want to show you a few scenes and to reflect very briefly with you on why I think those scenes are significant. So I've shown you the beginning of two films, La vita ricomincia and Il bandito, two films that begin as the soldier returns home. I think this film is very clearly trying to make a distinction from those other films. It comes out 1 year later. And this film, right from the beginning, is going to situate us in the American context, in the camp, among recognizably foreign settings, to let us know that this isn't the reduce coming home. This is the prisoner of war in a camp overseas.
Campo 18, Kenya. Caporale Carocci Nino, fu Carlo, da Foligno. La mamma.
Nino caro, stiamo bene. Abbiamo ricevuto tutte le tue lettere, ma aspettiamo te con ansia.
Campo 32, India. Capitano Verdiani Luigi, fu Alberto. Da Roma. La figlia Anna.
Caro papà, mamma sta bene, io sono passata all'esame. Ti bacio e ti benedico.
Campo 119, California. Soldato Bacigalupo Battista, Alberto da Genova. La sorella...
Hai visto? Appena nominato tua sorella, fischia e pennacchia e si è scassata la radio.
Accidente, le colpa di questo bell'imbusto di questo Battuso che tocca sempre i bottoni. Ma per cosa l'hai presa? Per una macchina da scrivere?
Balengo, ma non lo sai che a Torino ero impiegato alla radio io?
Facciatela, eri un usciere.
No, il faceva lo zelo. Ma vate che tenga Silva. Lasciala stare. No, quando penso che non sia di mia moglie, andò a Roma appositamente per parlare con mia, e stu scecco di pantelleria, tanto fischio, tanto visse, che spacciamo tutto. Un cuore si mangiasse, un cuore.
I'm happy to hear you laughing, because it is, I think, quite a funny film, and it's having its intended effect, right? To give this sense of the experience of these men who are clearly not suffering. And in fact, they go on to have a lovely Christmas dinner of tortellini and brodo and frascati wine. They fix the radio. They have a great time. And you might think, as you've now laughed along with the film and as you've seen Steve Mancini's beautiful film and got a sense of how significant this experience was, and how you've heard from me that this film stands alone as being the only attempt to represent it, you might think this was a film that the critics recognized right away as being an important milestone, right? A first attempt and a successful attempt. But you'd be very wrong. The critics were unanimous in saying that this film is a disaster, is not worth your time. They would tell you that it is a series of minor episodes of a banal, touristic musical nature. They would say that it's farcical, right, albeit with tones of nostalgia. The actors are good, but in the end, it's not worth very much. I think they're wrong, and I think they've missed an important point. But they're picking up perhaps on the way that this film, unlike so many of those neorealist films, Rome Open City and Paisan and Bicycle Thieves, which are attempting, I think, to do something new and different stylistically in terms of their genre, in terms of their presentation, in terms of their use of non-professional actors, for instance, and on-location shooting, that they're doing something different. And this film very much is not. This film holds to a standard that my dearly departed former colleague Chris Wagstaff noted, which is that the bulk of post-war films were produced, directed, written, acted, photographed, and distributed by exactly the same people who had made exactly the same kind of film before the war. And in this case, I would underline not only, as I've done here, exactly the same people, which is true in this case, but also exactly the same kind of film. This is a variety film, a variety film that has a series of vignettes, each motivated by a sort of central frame narrative. And those vignettes could have been made 10 years earlier, or 15 years earlier, or 20 years earlier. They looked exactly the same. They used sort of stereotypical music and stereotypical scenes. Guess what? The episode in Venice is about a love affair between a gondoliere and a tourist, right? It's all very cliched from that perspective. And again, it's made by sort of exactly the same kind of people who would have made exactly the same kind of film before. The director is I'm sorry if any of his family members are here, but is not a particularly accomplished film director, Pietro Francisci, who had made a few sort of minor films. This one, La Mia Vita Sei Tu from 1935. He had made a few documentaries, Rapsodia Romana, Edizione Straordinaria. He'd made a few minor films and remained a minor filmmaker until later on he became a sort of genre filmmaker in the 50s and 60s. The more accomplished filmmaker in this regard was Michele Galdieri, who is responsible for writing a number of very important songs, Monastero e Santa Chiara of 1945, Ma l'amore no of 1942, T'ho voluto bene of 1951, and he was also responsible for making a variety of variety films in the 1930s, Tre uomini in frac, which was directed by Mario Bonard in 1932, but which was written by Michele Galdieri, Inventiamo l'amore of Camillo Mastrocinque in 1938, Papà per una notte with Mario Bonard again in 1939. He had made exactly this kind of film, in other words, films filled with popular music, with sort of touristic vignettes, films that in many respects are quite like Natale al Campo 119. He'd done one other thing, though, that I think is worth pointing out in this film, which is that he worked a lot in the theater, in the variety theater. And in 1944, he produced a variety show with Anna Magnani and with Totò, which is called Con un palmo di naso, and which is a show that distinguishes itself because it mocks Hitler in 1944, which was not something that everybody was doing yet in Italy, and that I think has resonances in Natale al Campo 119 and suggests that the film, in fact, is perhaps more politically interesting, at least, than some of those critics were letting on. That it's perhaps not as open in its politics as that stage production had been, but it's a film that nevertheless has, at least I would argue that it has some political interest. And I want to show you again one short scene, one of those vignettes. We'll begin with a very short skirmish in the prisoner of war camp in California. And then, as in all of the other examples, we flash back from the prisoner of war camp to life back in Italy. In this case, to Aldo Fabrizi's life back in Rome. And he's thinking back to sort of the last days with his family, with his wife and his young children before he was sent off to Africa. And here we see him remembering his relationship, especially with his wife, which is where I'd like to draw your attention.
Non ci può rubare, siamo ospiti, è vero reverendo? Beh, vabbè. Ma che vabbè, poi una bottiglia di vino straniero. Ma che straniero? È Frascati. Guarda per il momento zitti, porco miseria. Come sarà capitato fin qua giù? È Dio che ce l'ha mandata. Allora possiamo berla senza rimorsi. Vedete, qui siamo tutti religiosi. Piano, attenti gli occhi. Mettiamo un culino sotto, si tocca tutto da fuori. Ragione. E come faremo senza botto? È il clima. Vorrei parlare. Silenzio, parla il signor Tenente. Pliso. Ma che è sto pliso? Si dice plisse. Sempre sta mania di voler parlare straniero. Questo è. E allora quando non sai l'inglese, state zitto. Io non parlo inglese, però io posso fare l'inglese quando mi pare e piace. Che è sta stupidaggine? Stupidaggine? Parli, signor Tenente. Non generale, ti metta i ferri. Allora auguri a tutti noi e alle nostre famiglie. Beh, finite? È finita. Auguri. Auguri ragazzi. Auguri. Non ci voleva E lei che fa, non beve? Me lasci statene. Frascati, Grottaferrata, Roma.
Lasciateci passare, siamo romani, dei giardini siamo i meglio fiori.
Cominciare un bel viaggio.
Oh! Siamo intesi, non camminare in mezzo alla strada! Aspetta! Non gli comprare il gelato che gli fa male! Senti? Non li lasciamo ai soli! E sta attento che non si sporchino il vestito! Oh! A mezzogiorno preciso davanti alla chiesa! E non fai come il solito tuo, che arrivi sempre dopo i fuochi!
Vattene da quel balcone, mi pari...
Che sole stamattina e che giornata, per i cieli azzurri ogni finestra in fiore, cammini e senti un non so che
Ragazzini, dai, passa il tram.
c'è la bocca amareggiata, la gente ride, canta e se ne va, tu stai che piangi e te vi è voglia di cantare.
Right. So this is quite typical of the film in giving both the sense of nostalgia, right? They're all missing their families at Christmas time, but also a sense that in some respects things might be a bit better in California, actually. And it's true of everyone. That Venetian gondolier, he ends up not being able to settle down with that tourist who goes back to her husband. And there's another character in each example. I think I'll cut it brief and just say in each example, there's some reasons why people might not want to go home. And in this case, Fabrizio doesn't want to go home because of his yelling wife in the balcony who reminds him, and I think is intended to remind us of Mussolini. Right? There is a political comment there, in fact, because not only does she gesture like Mussolini and harangue him like Mussolini, but later on in the episode when he brings the children back home and one of them is skinned a knee and she's not very happy, she says, "Ma tu stai bene solo in mezzo agli africani." Right? You're happy only among the Africans, right? Which is where, in fact, Mussolini is about to send him. It's not where he's happiest, in fact, and it's not where he belongs. But she doesn't seem to know that. And I think the film is drawing our attention there to the difference between the man he is and certainly the man he becomes in California, the man he's intended to become, and the man, I think, the kind of Italian that this film suggests the country needs to foster, which is different from the one that she imagines and different from the one that Mussolini had imagined. The film, in other words, I think has something political to say. But there's also something that it doesn't say, and it's something that came through quite clearly in Steve Mancini's film, so I think I can keep my comments brief. One thing to note is just how few prisoners were held in the United States. It's a very low percentage. So given that this is the only film to depict prisoners of war held in one of those foreign camps, it's striking that it's not one of the German camps, or not even one of the camps in Africa or in India. It's a very small percentage. I think they've chosen that United States camp for a particular reason, in other words. Another point, though, that this film doesn't emphasize is that conflict between those who would cooperate and those who didn't cooperate. As Mario de Prospero puts it, right, that was a moment of tension between the prisoners, and that kind of tension doesn't come through in this film at all. There's no question of cooperation. It doesn't come up. the film doesn't even acknowledge it as a possibility. At least not directly. Because what the film does do, in fact, is suggest another source of tension between the prisoners, another kind of confrontation with the prisoners, which I think is perhaps a sort of displacement of this question about cooperation or non-cooperation with the Americans and about whether or not one had been or would remain loyal to the fascists. The film turns all of this into a different kind of conflict, which is a conflict very familiar in Italian history. It's the conflict between North and South, right? The film stages a conflict, in other words, between the northern prisoners and the southerners that I think is supposed to stand in for a whole number of other conflicts that it's not going to acknowledge.
Tite domine Milan, sota ti se vive la vita.
Lei è milanese? Proprio de Porta Cicca, che sarebbe come dire milanese al 100%. Allora spiegatemi una frase slang, dialetto milanese che io non capisco. Ecco, che cosa significa macchi 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 ma? Se sta mai coi mani in mano, mai. Mai amore? Mai amore? Porco Jean-Pin Selfem. A Milano, gem certe tusan, mani in mano vuol dire...
Signor comandante, ve lo spiego io. È in due parole, è in italiano, perché io ho fatto il cocchiere, è vero, cocchiere affitto, ma io ho studiato. Questi qua, vedete, ce l'hanno con noi meridionali, non so per quale fatto storico, e ci chiamano torroni.
Sentite, se viene un continentale e mi chiama torrone, uguale ci mangio.
Ciao, Turiddu. Non ti crederà mica di essere un nordico alle volte.
E che è africano, sogno?
Lasciamo andare, va. La faccia un po' morretta ce l'hai. E poi quando parli chi ti capisce, bravo.
Italiano parlo, come a te.
Ma sta zitta, vai, terra ballerina.
Va bene. Qui quando c'è da disprezzare la terra degli altri, siamo tutti contenti. Però ricordatevi che è Catania. Tu vorresti paragonare Catania con Napoli.
Questo è noti meno ciacere. Ricordate che Genova è la prima città del mondo, che l'America l'abbiamo scoperta noi perché Cristoforo Colombo era genovese.
Ha fatto sto po' di capolavoro, se Cristoforo Colombo non scopriva l'America, noi a quest'ora eravamo prigionieri qui.
Tanti blisi.
Sì, perché Venezia è una roba da buttarsi da parte.
Quanto siete ragazzini con sto campanilismo stupido. Ma è possibile che non dobbiamo capire che tra noi italiani per andare d'accordo bisogna finirla di fare queste discussioni? Catania di giù, Genova di su, Milano di sotto, Napoli di qua. Ormai dobbiamo metterci in testa una cosa sola, Roma e basta.
Grazie, generale.
It's a much funnier conflict than fighting between the cooperators and non-cooperators, or between fighting fascists and anti-fascists. Right? But it's humor here that's tinged with some bitterness as well, and it comes through, I think, in that line where he says, as I have up here, you know, am I an African then? And the other responds, ma la faccio un po' moretta, ce l'hai, right? That you have a dark face. He's suggesting, in other words, not unlike Aldo Fabrizi's wife, who tells him that he's only happy among the Africans, that perhaps, right, he's not really an Italian, he's not really meant to be in Italy. And I think that the film, right, even if this is a displacement from a kind of conflict that the film doesn't want to acknowledge, I think the film is doing something quite interesting with the conflict that it does acknowledge, right? Because these men were captured in Africa. Several of them were, we learn, had important roles among the colonial leadership. Some of them here are being accused of being more like those colonial subjects than like colonial agents. And the film tries to turn this on its head by suggesting that men need to find a new identity, right? That they're no longer the global superpower that Mussolini told them that they were, and that they're no longer going to go out for colonial conquest, and that they should no longer be divided this way. They need to learn to see themselves in a new light. And the way that it does this is through very interesting use of an African-American spiritual that comes at a key moment, in fact, as these men are fighting, and that brings them together, and brings them together with the Americans who are guarding their camp.
Come Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home.
So here I think we see an image, and we hear the words of what that new identity might look like. Right? It's nostalgia, and it's nostalgia particularly that they're experiencing a long way from home in America that is going to ground their new Italian identity, right? And the film, as I've said already, uses quite a lot of Italian music. Each episode in each different city uses local music as a way of underlining that experience. Rome and Florence and Genoa and Venice. They have a record album that has Italy written on the cover that they listen to, but all that does is divide them, right? This is the moment that they come together. It's with American music. It's with African-American music. And in that jockeying for position there, with the American putting his arm on the shoulder of the Italian, there's a sense of camaraderie, but it's camaraderie that has a hierarchy as well. It's about acknowledging where they stand now. They did lose a war. And what comes next, right, the way that the film then ends, is by underlining exactly that message. Right? The message, as you'll hear here delivered by a priest, is that we need to be a bit better. Right? Let's go home and be better. Right? So we should learn something from this experience in America that we're going to now bring back to Italy. And the film ends again with a typical song, with a Neapolitan song, Torna, right, which is about forgetting the past and settling and rebuilding.
Ite missa est, Deo gratias, in nome del Padre, Figliuolo, Spirito Santo, così sia. E qui, miei cari figliuoli, non vi parla il sacerdote, no, qui parla un vostro compagno, che ha diviso per molto tempo la vostra malinconia e il vostro sconforto, e magari anche la vostra fame, perché maniera smagnava pochino. Ma adesso, grazie a Dio, anche questa è finita. Ora noi torneremo alle nostre case, guarderemo un po' tristi i capelli imbiancati delle nostre mamme, ma anch'esse scorgeranno sul nostro capo più d'un filo d'argento. Chi potrà mai dimenticare tutto quello che abbiamo patito in questi lunghi anni noi qui? Ragazzi, facciamo che quel ricordo ci renda più buoni e ci aiuti ad amare anche di più la nostra bella Italia.
Sta casa aspetta te.
funny film, and it's a touching film. It's a nostalgic film. It's in many respects a traditional film. But I think that critic has it wrong. It's anything but a banal film. I think it's a film that has something, in fact, quite serious to say. And something that I think the other film that we've seen this evening about Letterkenny might also help us to understand. And so I think I'll just conclude by saying I hope that you'll stay to watch the film, because I think it's a lot more important than we've realized thus far. So thank you very much, and enjoy Natale al Campo 119.
Film, if you have any questions for the speakers. So it's been a very long night. Thank you so much for staying. But if you have any curiosity or any questions about the... Steve, you can sit. If you want to sit next to Alan. Yeah. So any question about these movies? Yes, Theo. Yeah.
I am curious about when you guys mentioned that there was a cooperation with the Italian prisoners with the Americans. What kind of cooperation was that? Being active in war as a soldiers or supplying intelligence information for the American army?
Just to understand the question, Americans cooperating with Italian POWs or with Italians reconstituted Italian soldiers, because there were units that were composed after the armistice and the Declaration of Co-Belligerency, comprised in the South. They were constituted, that is, in the South, and they fought primarily with the British Eighth Army. But there were units that fought with the American Fifth Army that went up. But the type of cooperation that you would see in this, that's actually not where there were cooperators, that was real. There were American and Italian Americans and Italians in the leadership cadre that worked together, and they interacted. And there's a wonderful anecdote of an American first lieutenant taking an Italian second lieutenant driving an American Jeep at Letterkenny to a particular site of work, and he broke too quickly and had a sort of a fishtail, and the American got really upset, that the second lieutenant Italian didn't know how to drive. And so, they had a back and forth, and because the Italian didn't like what he was, how he's being responded, and didn't like his, in fact, being criticized for his driving, he spouted back. And so, charges were brought up, but then they were dismissed because, it was just something that wasn't really all that important. But there were these moments of incredible cooperation in at least where the cooperating Italian POWs were intermixing with Italians, with American soldiers. Somewhat more like Hereford, where there were non-collaborators. There wasn't that sort of interaction, except with a really very, very touching, important story when Americans invited Italians to go to a nearby town and decorate this church, St. Mary's in Umbarger. So, and it's an incredibly wonderful story, and that itself is another wonderful piece of material evidence. But there were moments of interaction between them that it's really interesting that to be honest, Charles, I've never seen the movie. I can't believe it. I mean, there's some historically very important resonances with this movie. Thank you.
I don't know if you want me to say it. No, we'll do it on another occasion. Okay. We have in the room a lady who volunteered when she was 14 in a nearby POW camp for Italians, but there will be another evening.
I've read that German POWs in Texas, the American GIs who were there were very mad because they said that the Germans were the Germans were the enemy and they were treated better than the black GIs. And that these German POWs, many of them didn't want to go back to Germany, they wanted to stay in America. My question is, were any of the Italians, POWs in America, allowed to stay if they didn't marry an American girl?
No, in fact, by law, international law, all Italian POWs had to be repatriated to Italy. And the process was many of them that had girlfriends or actual fiancés were not allowed to marry in the United States before the end of the war, and then even after the end of the war. They had to go back without having married, and many followed them to Italy, married there, and that expedited the, I don't know if it was a visa process, but getting them back to the United States, permission to get back to the United States. Many of them wanted to. Some, I know, that stayed actually in Italy and had a life. This is an American wife that stayed in Italy. But they were not allowed to stay. Many of them wanted to, and we've been able, at least for Letterkenny, to find approximately 22 Italians that came back. So, I mean, yeah.
I think what I might add is that a similar experience to what you're describing with the German prisoners in Texas happened with Italian prisoners in Seattle at Fort Lawton, with a violent clash between them for exactly the reasons you've described. And one of the many things I find so interesting about this film, which is set in California, is that there are very few markers that suggest that it's set in California. And there's some evidence to suggest that they were deciding until the end where this camp was going to be. So a few of the reviews, for instance, say that it's in Texas. And as there's some reporting on the set as they were filming the film that said it was going to be set in Texas. And my suspicion is that they heard a bit about Camp Hereford and decided that it didn't make much sense to set this film in Texas. And I think it wouldn't have made much sense to set it in Seattle either, given the role here of that African-American soldier. I think that there are some problems, in other words, that they're trying to avoid. There are very real problems in very real places.
In terms of the locations, the varied locations of prisoners of war and the length of stay. And although there was this expectation that they would be returning to Italy, was there any time in which Jim Crowism was introduced as part of their experience in this country to learn about it?
I've come across a couple of memoirs where the Italian, this is at Letterkenny, so they were collaborating with American workers, a lot of whom, at least in the offices, were women, administrative offices. And the people that they worked with, of course, explained to them. They had heard about this, of course, the separation, of course, in Italy. They came, they saw it. Even in Pennsylvania, I don't know if you know, but even in Pennsylvania, on a U.S. Army post, there were colored-only bathrooms, and that's that's southern Pennsylvania at the time. So they knew that. They knew they weren't supposed to go there. They also formed their own. And, from diaries that I've read, they've also formed their own. There's been comments that they didn't really fully understand it because they were very good people. That giving voice to that, but they definitely had an encounter with Jim Crow, and experienced aspects of it. Oh, I see what you're saying. So that experience. So in other words, Americans treating them as somehow racially different, darker. The Italians, yeah. Well, no, that's actually in literature as well. They at least in southern Pennsylvania, they were and because of the immigrant experience, they were seen as second-class citizens. Many of them were darker, and they were identified as different. And they expressed that. So that sense of them, officially, no. Officially, they weren't segregated. They weren't told not to go to certain restrooms, but there was definitely, I know civilians that would comment, I don't want her, my daughter, anywhere near these Italians because they're second. I've come across that. Yeah.
Thank you. And if I may, Charles and Steve, what about the reception of these movies? I mean, what was your experience screening the film in Italy and in the US? And Charles, do we know whether Natale al Campo 119 ever made it outside of Italy in the 40s?
I don't believe that it did. It was near the top of the box office in Italy for the year. It was in the top 10 most popular films, but it wasn't one of the ones. In years where there were Italian films that had a huge international success, when Rome Open City played for a year straight in New York, this was not one of those films, but it did quite well for the Italian market.
And Steve, your experience?
So overall, it was very well received. When we took it to Milan and Rome, a lot of the families showed up. They really appreciated it. From the film festival, I think we're in about 6 different countries, so it's kind of a shock. This is my first directed film, so I'm like, surprised. I want to go back to the question on the Italians being treated a little differently. That was nothing new, had nothing to do with the war. But before the war, Italian immigrants were treated very badly. In fact, I do a podcast on. I had a gentleman who is part of the Hershey Historical Society for the Italians, and I think up into the 40s, you would still see if you wanted to buy a house, it would say if you're in certain neighborhoods, it would say you're not allowed to sell to Italians. So that was already happening to Italians. In fact, one of the largest lynchings in American history was actually Italians. A lot of people don't know that. So Italians were discriminated against, but it is interesting because whatever reason, the soldiers, in a sense, weren't getting that treatment, which I never thought about that. I never put that together because the immigrants were treated badly, but for some reason it seems like they didn't play that game with the soldiers. I don't know why. At least not as openly.
Okay, it's 8:35. So for those of you who want to stay for the movie, thank you very much for staying, and thank you very much to our wonderful speakers. It was very interesting, and so enjoy the movie. Thank you.